Welcome to News from Neptune for December 6th in the 49th week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government in the aftermath of World War I, said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. Remarkably enough, we seem to be verging on a discussion in this country of what the term socialist actually means. It's not easy, owing to generations of U.S. propaganda. Noam Chomsky, who inspires our program, says, terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in Karl Marx's sense in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes who called themselves socialist made immense progress in the 20th century, notably in Russia and China. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available on archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either to repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I, with the help of J.B. Nicholson, will try to say some true things on a Fight Race Reductionism edition of News from Neptune. That will define, I think, that will involve at the start here saying what we mean by race reductionism, saying who does it and who doesn't, and describing the alternative. Here's a start from the dark backward and abyss of time. Tariq Ali, the British socialist, wrote 40 years ago about C.L.R. James. He says C.L.R. James is now, by any standards, an old man, and he's writing this in 1980. He appears somewhat frail, but this impression evaporates when he begins to talk. It's almost as if one is being transported back to the polemical debates and arguments of the 1930s. James was born in the West Indies some 80 years ago, 80 years plus 40 now. He came to Britain in the 1930s, and soon developed a reputation as a sports writer and historian, and a major voice in the Trotskyist left. I had heard him last speak, says Tariq Ali, at the Dialectics of Liberation Conference in 1967. On that occasion, he had clashed fiercely with the black American leader Stokely Carmichael. Race is decisive, Carmichael had thundered. No, James had replied with quiet dignity, it is class. According to an increasingly popular narrative among American liberals, a dispiriting plurality of progressives are class reductionists, people who believe that economic equality is a cure-all for societal ills, and who as a result would neglect policy prescriptions which seek to remedy identity-based disparities. Of course, race and class are so interwoven that any political project that aims to resolve one while ignoring the other does a disservice to both. As Senator Bernie Sanders, presumptive leader of the progressive movement, put it this spring when I asked him about the never-ending race versus class debates, quote, it's not either or, it's never either or, it's both. Ending racism is a necessary, critical goal, but that goal should be pursued in tandem with efforts to address the effects of racism. The wage gap, the health care gap, the education gap, the debt gap, all these disparities would be narrowed by progressive, intersectional economic programs. As popular opinion coalesces around these policies, it's crucial that we not let our best impulses be weaponized against our interests any more than conservative weaponize their worst impulses of their constituents against their interests. It's the fear that identity-based politics might be thrown under the bus in favor of more populist universal policies is legitimate. The Democratic Party has certainly done as much in the recent past for causes less noble than class equality. But the irony is that anxiety over class reductionism has led some to defensively embrace an equally unproductive and regressive ideology, race reductionism. Now, I think there's something to this account. I'm quoting from an article in The Intercept recently, and I actually think the situation is slightly more nefarious than The Intercept suggests. Identity politics was proposed by American liberals in the 1970s as they cast around for something to be in favor of, having abandoned the class interests that were always at the base of even the New Deal programs. The resurgence of New Deal thinking in the Sanders campaign these days reminds us that there was a great refusal in American politics in the 1970s when the left, or liberals, the terms are extremely plastic, opted for identity politics rather than for class politics. And the debate still goes on in important ways on the left, but we should begin with unmasking neoliberalism as identity politics as a cover for neoliberalism. And that's what the question of race reductionism is finally about.
Yes, and the people that I want to mention in this regard, the critiques that I've had and that I've read of some of the major people in this field have not necessarily accused them of engaging in blatant identity politics, but the clear implication of these critiques is that that's where this leads them. A few of the texts that I think we need to deal with here. First of all, the major thing, and for the ordinary person who wants to delve into this, I think, Carl, you led me on to the WSWS website to deal with their criticism of the 1619 project, the New York Times project, which is being ballyhooed and which is apparently going to be incorporated into the curriculum of high schools or worse as we move forward. And this is appalling. This is appalling. Not that high school history curriculums regarding slavery and race and so forth are any good now, but this isn't going to make them any better. So I thank you, Carl, for leading me on to this. One of the authors of these articles, a couple of these articles, and one of the interviewers on the WSWS website, World Socialist website, is a fellow who used to be around here named Tom Mackaman, who we knew back in the day. He's actually a first cousin of the late Rachel Corrie, who died in 2003 in Gaza, killed by an Israeli bulldozer, a woman from Washington State.
As she demonstrated
as a part of the international solidarity movement at that time. But that aside, the primary text here would just be the critique of the 1619 series on the New York Times website. But let me mention a few other authors here just to give our researcher heads up in listing some of these things for anybody who may want to go more deeply into them. The book Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson was written about 20 years, maybe more than that ago,
so, yeah.
1980s maybe, and that has become a kind of a primary text, even though I'm not quite sure how many people actually read it. The most cogent criticism from a Marxist point of view can be looked up, written by a fellow at an obscure university in North Carolina named Gregory Myerson, Myerson. The other primary texts for these movements, for these identity race reductionist movements, strangely race reductionist movements in that they're reducing the white race, not just the black race. They're mainly reducing the white race to being. They're basically reducing white people to being allegedly incorrigibly racist. The most famous, as you know, Carl, the wages of whiteness thesis put forward by the former faculty member here, David Roediger. And we must mention in this context the late, just recently died, Noel Ignatiev, who was a founder of the journal, who wrote a book called Race Trader, and was founder of the journal called Race Trader, which one can access online through, I think, a website at Brown that's maintained by Brown University.
Let me mention, too, that he was also author of an important book that was particularly important in the Northeast when it came out, northeast of the U.S., How the Irish Became White.
Right, exactly. That's what he's most well known for.
Which is a very interesting point, yes. The thesis is the social changes that produced the despised Irish immigrants in America, how they were incorporated into the white community, when if you'd said that they belonged there to an average upper-class Bostonian in the 1830s and the 1850s, they would have, they probably would have thrown you out of the building in the first place. But.
So, we're not arguing here that there's no such thing as race, but it's a social construct. We're not arguing here that there's no such thing as whiteness, but it's a social construct. And how has that evolved culturally, politically, in the changing material circumstances of the last 300 or 400 years in this country, or if we want to go back to 1619, which the New York Times is wanting us to do? How would we do that? How would we do that from a Marxist point of view? The two most cogent criticisms of the wages of whiteness thesis and Roediger's work come from Theodore Allen, who is usually associated as part of this whiteness construct school, but he takes a different view, and he wrote an elaborate criticism of Roediger's work, as has a fellow named Cedric Johnson up at University of Illinois Chicago in the recent issue, or on the website of Nonsite, Nonsite, which is the website that is partly edited by the venerable Adolph Reed, who is on the anti-race reductionist school in this fight, or the anti-essentialist school in this fight. So let me just read one paragraph from this lengthy criticism that Theodore Allen wrote about Roediger from a Marxist point of view, trying to get at what a Marxist perspective on these wages of whiteness issues are. This is in this article, in this sort of Marxist analytical discourse. This is point number 67, way down, I think, the last point that he made. It is the thesis of race as a social construct, as it now stands, despite its value in objectifying whiteness, is an insufficient basis for refutation of white supremacist apologetics, and for advancing the abolition of whiteness, quote unquote, the abolition of whiteness being what Roediger and Noel Ignatiev have devoted themselves to in their work. The logic must be tightened, Allen goes on, the logic must be tightened and the focus sharpened, just as it is unhelpful, to say the least, to euphemize racial slavery in continental Anglo-America as, quote, the peculiar institution, end quote, instead of identifying the, quote-unquote, white race itself as the truly peculiar institution governing the life of this country, after emancipation as it did in slavery times. Just as it is not race in general that must be understood, but the white race in particular. So the white race, quote unquote, must be understood not simply as a social construct rather than a genetic phenomenon, but as a ruling class social control formation. And one more point he makes at the end, that was point 66, this is point 67.
He spared you the introduction.
I spared you the first 65 points,
Right.
but they're well worth reading if you really want to follow this argument, which takes us many fascinating places. It is not enough to reject the natural racism idea, quote unquote. It must be confronted by a self-standing, completely opposite theory in full array and driven from the field. For Marxists of whatever vintage they may be, who espouse the race as social construct thesis, this requires taking up behaviorally and forensically 4 basic challenges. First, to show that white supremacism is not an inherited attribute of European American personality. This was written before the 1619 Project, of course, in many years. I think this was written back in 2005 or so. But that's basically what the 1619 Project is, what this Hannah Nicole Jones, Hannah Jones is arguing in that. First, to show that white supremacism is not an inherited attribute of the European American personality, which is implied in this piece. Secondly, to demonstrate that white supremacism has not served the interests of the laboring class European Americans. Third, to account for the prevalence of white supremacism within the ranks of laboring class European Americans. Fourth, by the light of history, to consider ways whereby European American laboring people may cast off the stifling incubus of white identity. And basically what Theodore Allen is arguing, has been arguing in this piece, I think he has died since then also, is that the Roediger perspective, gave too much essentialist determination to the notion of whiteness as being a kind of permanent and almost biological factor in the evolution of racial identity in this country and the exploitation of racial identity by class forces. I guess the most famous phrase, or the most familiar phrase that I like to argue about with some of my friends, is that Roediger argued that one may argue that race is a social construct, but that Roediger is arguing that race has a life of its own that carries on through various material contexts to the present day. Thus, the ongoing concern that white people just can't change. And I would add to that the whole implication of the arguments that are being made now, that have been made for the last few years in this context, are that some white people can change. It's the well-educated professional managerial class that can change, that has changed. They put Obama into the presidency, but that it's those white working class, white supremacists, white nationalists, all the Hillary Clinton deplorables are the ones that really can't change. If you're in Brooklyn, you can change.
You're listening to News from Neptune, and we are talking about the assumptions being made in the discussion of race and class in the U.S., and how these are not merely academic fetishes, as David was just describing, but are politically important. The brilliant American historian Barbara Fields has pointed out in an absolutely crucial observation, it seems to me, about the way the discussion is conducted, that the most intellectually debilitating is of the assumptions by American historians is that any situation involving people of European descent and people of African descent automatically falls under the heading race relations. Argument by definition and tautology thereby replaces argument by analysis in anything to do with people of African descent. Probably a majority of American historians, and I'm going to line this from kicking around in the historical profession for a while, a majority of American historians think of slavery in the United States as primarily a system of race relations. That's what the 1619 date refers to in the series that the New York Times is sponsoring, that David was talking about. That was the year in which African slaves were first brought to Jamestown in Virginia, the English colony in the, quote, New World. Probably a majority of American historians think of slavery in the United States as primarily a system of race relations, as though the chief business of slavery were the production of white supremacy, rather than the production of cotton, sugar, rice, and tobacco. One historian has gone so far as to call slavery the ultimate segregator. He does not ask why Europeans seeking the ultimate method of segregating Africans would go to the trouble and expense of transporting them across the ocean for that purpose, when they could have achieved the same result so much more simply by leaving the Africans in Africa. No one dreams of analyzing the struggle of the English against the Irish as a problem of race relations, even though the rationale that the English developed for suppressing the barbarian Irish later served nearly word for word as a rationale for suppressing Africans and indigenous American Indians. Nor does anyone dream of analyzing serfdom in Russia as primarily a problem of race relations, even though the Russian nobility invented fictions of their innate natural superiority over the serfs as preposterous as any devised by American racists. Now, this is an important point, and the race reductionists are exactly those who want to ignore the fundamentally economic and class-based reasons for the generation of race mythology in the U.S. as in Britain, Russia, and elsewhere. And it seems to me that we're definitely taking a step backwards when we take the notion that class and economic exploitation can be set aside in the fight against racism. It can't, as C.L.R. James said all those years ago.
And it's, as I commented in an email to the Peace listserv this morning in response to an article from the Wall Street Journal that was posted by our former colleague Ron Zoke about wealth inequality and the basis of is something to do with the boomers and sort of generational understanding of wealth inequality. And you can do the same thing for generational analysis or racial, but it doesn't get at the fact that wealth is extremely highly accumulated among a few percentage of the population for white people as a whole, apart from black people. And that gap has grown in the last 40 years. And one can say that when one looks at this particular chart in the Wall Street Journal and sees that the baby boomers, this group of people that is, I guess, from at this point age, let's see, I'm doing my
generation
75 to 50 to 75 to 55 or so, or 58 or something like that. We, quote unquote, have a larger percentage of the wealth than a similar age cohort did 40 years ago or 20 years ago. But that's only because so much wealth has been accumulated by the top 0.1% and 1% and 10%, to the point where that the top 10% overall has at least 3/4 of the private sort of family-based wealth. So it doesn't really reflect on white people versus black people. It reflects on social class. And it's hard to find data that doesn't emphasize either this sort of generational, well, maybe I haven't looked hard enough, but when you see these, and when you see it especially in the Wall Street Journal, you know that they're not going to get at the basics of what has been driving this incredible increase in wealth inequality and on the basis of income inequality in this country for the past 40 years.
I think it's important to realize that Trump is being impeached by the military-industrial complex, the people working for them, because he was the first major party candidate in 40 years to attack the neocon, more war, and neo-lib, more austerity, policies of all recent administrations. Though in office he's largely adopted those policies, the permanent government, the establishment of these people working for the 1%, are afraid he'll act on his attacks by, for example, withdrawing troops from Afghanistan and Syria. Those attacks in the campaign were in fact what made him president, by speaking for the growing populist wave of those who saw that Obama's promises of prosperity weren't being fulfilled. It's important to realize that Trump flipped 6 states that had gone for Obama in 2012 in the 2016 election. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Ohio, and Florida had voted for Obama. The states had voted for Obama in the 2012 election, but they did not vote for Clinton, Obama's obvious successor, in the 2016 election. Those states were lost by Obama voters who stayed home rather than voting again for a Democratic nominee, in this case, Hillary Clinton. They had seen no hope and change in the Obama years, the years in which wealth had continued to concentrate in American society and concentrate at an accelerating rate. The immiseration of the majority was the occasion of, or the cause of, Trump's elections. All Trump's election in 2016. So all the Trump haters have right now, all Trump's opponents have, everybody hates Trump, that's not the issue. All Trump's opponents have right now are not criticisms of policies, because after all, those policies as tried under Obama produced the alienation that elected Trump. All the Trump's critics have are basically schoolboy insults. Someone has summarized that under the phrase "orange man bad." That's the politics, because what's actually being insisted upon is that the pro-war and pro-austerity policies of the Bush and Obama administrations be restored, and Trump is threatening not to do that. There's the source of the impeachment, the Russiagate phenomenon, and the impeachment move. It's a circus, and the circus is occasionally interesting. I'm going to watch the fulminations of some remarkably embarrassing academics, including a woman from Stanford Law School this week. It makes me doubly sad.
I've been privileged not to watch 1 minute of it. But,
well, it's sort of a penance, an Advent penance for me.
Well, speaking of penance, Carl, you've been making yourself even more unpopular than you usually are.
Well, it's Advent,
And I understand that. I understand that people don't want to be told that Trump is this whole process has been a kind of a farce. But,
people suggest that I've, in these arguments, the ones, most of them carried on online that you're talking about, people suggest I'm defending Trump. I'm not defending Trump at all. What I'm trying to do is understand the Trump phenomenon and set up an opposition other than Orange Man Bad, because that's, as I say, a schoolboy taunt. And what we need to do is have an analysis of what's really going on in American politics and what's being demanded by the American population that is being twisted and turned and directed against Trump by the defenders of the American 1%, the so-called political class or political establishment. That's the argument that should be going on. Yeah. And it begins with a clear analysis of what actually is happening in American politics, and that's hard to come by.
Yeah. Speaking of being unpopular, I kind of wish somebody would write a letter trying to refute what I've been saying in the News Gazette regarding identity politics and its relation to, say, gender issues or immigration issues. In my last couple of what I thought would be fairly controversial letters and pretty pointedly personal, individual level criticism, but there just doesn't seem to be any willingness of people in this sort of liberal community, sort of this liberal anti-racist identity politics community to even respond to what I'm saying. Not to mention your anti-war letter or salute for the service letter, but I think they might have actually when they took out the Monday newspaper, I think they took that out with it. So you may not have that one to beat around anymore.
Like Richard Nixon, we won't have it to kick around anymore.
Yeah, right. I was only 12 years old when he said that, but
so was
and I recall it vividly. Anyway, I've just been fascinated to see, in this sort of politically intimate community, to see how people relatively well known in our circles of people or in the Urbana-Champaign political class of people, how this has played out in the 21 years that I've been living here, and to see all these groups forming after the Obama presidency, and then after in relation to the anti-war movement, which basically Obama destroyed the anti-war movement in this country, and you could see that locally. And then after Trump, now you can see all these groups forming, all these sort of proto-Zionist groups forming, claiming that they're all for immigrant rights, and they're all for bend the arc and Solidarity Sundays, and this showing up for racial justice stuff that goes on, that went on at the Unitarian Universalist Church. This is all just there's so much local empirical data that shows in this university town, especially on campus, that just shows how this process, how this anti-racist, how this race reductionist process has played out over the years, to the detriment of any real anti-war movement, any real left socialist movement, any real pro-Palestine movement, for that matter. So it's very clear to me what's been going on around here as I see person by person, group by group, how these people rationalize Orange Man Bad.
If they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about answers, said Thomas Pynchon a long time ago, and an important novel. And that's precisely the political establishment's defense right now. They're not trying to suppress debate. They're just trying to make sure that the debate moves in the right channels, that the proper limits of debate are set, that the wrong questions are being asked. And the wrong questions now include, how do we remove Donald Trump from office without doing too much damage to the constitutional fabric? If they can get you asking that question and arguing about it, they don't have to worry about answers, because their writ will run regardless, and that's important. That's a matter of the economy.
How can this be seen anything other than just political theater? given the fact that the Democratic Party is determined to, impeach Trump, and the Republican Party is equally determined to not convict Trump. I mean, this has all been foretold. Where's the the drama here? I don't see it.
I have to admit that the political theater aspect of it, I faintly enjoy. And it's a guilty pleasure, but it is a pleasure nonetheless.
Well, it's not baseball season. I guess I can understand it.
It's the substitute for baseball.
Yeah.
When baseball comes back, we won't have to worry about this. So that may be true.
There's probably a reason they're doing it at this time of year. Yeah.
Inside baseball, by the way, this week led to the departure of Kamala Harris.
Yes.
From the presidential
Kamala,
race.
We hardly knew ye.
Well, certainly we did, and that was not an accident. It was important that Kamala be kept from us, so to speak, in terms of who and what she really was. She was the leading candidate, all the right-thinking people said, as soon as she announced her run for the presidency. She was seen as the major candidate in a crowded Democratic field at the beginning, but good as our researcher J.B. Nicholson asked, how major could she have been all this time? This is important because an awful lot of this discussion is carried on the basis of the polls show. The polls show this, the polls show that, and of course as soon as Kamala Harris became a candidate, the polls showed, so we were told, that she was the leading candidate. After all, she must be a leading candidate. She's a black woman, right? And the people who put that forward are given the title of experts by mainstream media, which is busily concerned about making a black woman who happened to be a defender of the worst aspects of the political establishment to make her a leading candidate. Well, that was yesterday. New things are going on today. The awful Pete Buttigieg becomes a leading candidate, and the same people who said that Kamala Harris was are now saying that he is. This is a matter of getting people to ask the wrong questions, and it seems to be working.
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, I don't usually make superficial comments about politicians and their demeanors and so forth, but it was so obvious to me, and I said it on this program from the start, that Kamala Harris just wasn't going to have the charismatic qualities to carry her very far, and that proved to be the case on these superficial debate stages and so on and so forth. And she just didn't, I mean, whatever Obama had that allowed him to find favor with the ruling class and to capture, I mean, not that Kamala Harris didn't, but also capture the imagination of liberal people. Kamala Harris didn't have. Of course, it was a different race when Obama ran against 2 or 3 other people as opposed to running against 20 people. And I have to say, Buttigieg, well, what's going on here? Well, let me make another superficial comment here, superficial speculative comment here, Carl. What the New York Times is doing is they're wanting to out Buttigieg. Mm-hmm. He's a gay man, but this isn't about being gay. They're wanting to out him as a former employee of the infamous McKinsey consulting group, right, where neoliberals go around doing nasty things with businesses around the world and cutting people's pay and moving jobs overseas and doing all the kind of consulting that's involved in globalized neoliberalism. Well, why is the New York Times doing this in early December of 2019? I would guess that it's to get it off the table. Okay, they want him to come clean enough. I know you're bringing up there, what is Pete Buttigieg hiding? Right.
Important article.
But I don't think the New York Times is going after him. I think he's their fair-haired boy.
No.
And so they want to put it on the table.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this in fact doesn't. I'm referring here to an article by Max Blumenthal and.
Well, that's a different one. That's
exactly. Yeah.
Right. But
and Ben Norton talking about what Buttigieg actually did in the military.
Oh, okay.
Remember, Buttigieg to make himself saleable on the political market, became a veteran. Naval intelligence, which seems to be the desired place of American Pauls who want to make a name for themselves as intelligent veterans, and what he actually was doing, and what he was doing for his old clients, is the question that's being raised by Blumenthal and Norton, and it's worthwhile. I mean, Buttigieg is a piece of work, and he is. He's nobody's fool, in spite of the fact that Tulsi Gabbard made him look foolish in the last debate, and the idea that he was engaged in nefarious ruling class activity even while he was a naval intelligence officer in Afghanistan. You may ask about that too. Is
Why do we
worthwhile
need a
talking about.
Navy? How did the Navy get to Afghanistan?
That's right.
Isn't
because
that
Pete
like
Buttigieg
there's
needed
not
a
an
job.
ocean near Afghanistan, is there?
And the account of these various aspirants to the presidency need to be examined closely, because the careful construction of a candidate by the media is what we're seeing in regard to Buttigieg, and what we would have seen in regard to Harris if the product had sold. But it didn't, so now we make the sort of adjustments that any capitalist enterprise will make in marketing its product. Buttigieg is being rearranged for marketing, and Kamala has been withdrawn from the market. Okay.
And Buttigieg is seen by the professional managerial class as being sort of the more presentable candidate vis-a-vis Trump than
and Joe Biden.
Than Elizabeth Warren or
yeah.
Joe Biden. And of course, none of them want Sanders to get anywhere near it.
Exactly, and move in that direction.
So I think they're saying that a Buttigieg Klobuchar ticket is probably the way to go. That's the ticket, as they used to say.
That's the ticket. According to CBS News, the following 6 candidates have already qualified: Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, Tom Steyer. You haven't heard about him because he's decided to cash in his cards. Sanders and Warren. And according to CBS News, the bar to qualify has been raised once again. Candidates need to prove they have at least 200,000 unique donors, including at least 800 in 20 different states, U.S. territories, or the District of Columbia. That's an increase from 165,000 last month. They also have to reach either 4% in at least 4 national or early state polls, or reach 6% in 2 early state polls. That's an increase from 3 and 5%. I mean, all of these are, of course, quite arbitrary. But the result is the media presents us with reliable candidates, allowable candidates, and the candidates themselves take their cues from that, as Kamala Harris just done. In other words, the establishment really wants, guess who, Tulsi Gabbard out. It's naive to think that they'll let Sanders or Gabbard represent that party. However, their party. However, they're apparently so greedy that they refuse to let Gabbard's consistently low polling numbers do the job of objecting her by simply sticking to older standards of polling result and claiming that she's just not getting enough interest in her campaign. They raise the standards to exclude her. Gabbard never challenges the figures that could be used to justify her own exclusion, despite an ugly history of getting evaluations so wrong, including Hillary Clinton's 90% plus chance of being president in 2016, calling Harris a major or leading candidate, and allowing Harris to call herself that without critique. We're supposed to accept that hardly anyone is interested in the only voice among the Democrats that at least speaks to challenging the wars. And that, of course, is Tulsi Gabbard. The presentation of the run-up to this election is a remarkable exercise in setting the bounds of allowable debate. And Tulsi is outside those bounds.
I guess as we're sitting here and I'm sort of just thinking about what you're saying and thinking about these people, as much as I don't even do this in my private time. I don't know why I'm doing it in public. But Buttigieg, I guess, given the fact that we know what the key states are vis-a-vis the 2020 presidential election. We know what the key Midwestern states are. We know it's all about that. And Buttigieg is at least from a state in the thick of all that, and they can see him that way. And there's a lot of ways to look at what happened in 2016, and it's somewhat arbitrary to slice and dice in any particular way. But one thing that interested me is that basically Hillary Clinton won California by 6 million votes, or 5 or 6 million votes, and she lost the rest of the country by 2 or 3 million votes. And that, I think that tells you something about this country. I mean, there's obviously other blue states, but the idea that Kamala Harris, that they thought that anybody from such a blue state as California was gonna attract votes in Wisconsin, Michigan, and so forth. The rest of the country doesn't like California.
Don't feel bad.
It's okay. I don't like it much anymore either. But
some of my best friends are Californians.
Yeah, I know. But still, it's like, I know it's a superficial way to talk about the kind of issues that we in relation to the kind of issues we're talking about as we started this program. But still, the wheels are spinning in regarding to how you get this done, in terms of the parts of the country that the coasts don't care about.
Yeah, the flyovers, as a friend of mine used to say, right?
And
it is important to see that the last presidential election, was decided in flyover countries, if you can muscle Florida into the flyover country, flyover states. But still in all, our researcher Jeff Nicholson supplies the following. Jimmy Dore just released a clip explaining how he, that is Jimmy Dore, Aaron Mate, and Tucker Carlson. Now remember, Tucker Carlson, in the proper understanding, is a terrible right-wing Fox News person, are among the very few talking sense and truth about the Syrian gas attack that has been bubbling around, so to speak, on the edge of the news for a while. The best evidence says that those gas canisters that were blamed on the insurgents blamed on the Syrian government, let's have that right, were placed, not dropped, and by the Syrian government, and 2 OPCW engineers, that is the Poisonous Chemical Warfare Organization, the organization designed to combat the use of poison gas in war, have had to leak their own reports to get that word out. But these lies ostensibly justified the U.S., UK, French coordinated missile attack, which followed on. MSNBC Ryan Williams saying, "I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons as they cover the missiles being launched by replaying Pentagon video recorded earlier the same day." Now, the point is that it's been revealed that this notion that there was a Syrian government gas attack in Douma was a conscious lie. An attempt to predict or to set up a reason for further attacks against the Syrian government that the American, French, and British governments have carried on for a good long time. Paragraph Point 2 of the OPCW official report on Duma states that based on the high levels of various chlorinated organic derivatives defined in environmental samples, describing the levels as high likely overstate the extensive levels of these poisons. The point is that the argument put forward by the OPCW was known to be false when it was established, and we know that now from whistleblowers within the OPCW. Nevertheless, this is continued as a reason for the ongoing American attacks on Syria, in spite of the fact that the Commander-in-Chief of the American forces in Syria has said he wants to withdraw them. Unfortunately, his writ doesn't run in Syria in spite of the falsifications that are put forward to maintain American troops in Syria. This is a serious problem not just for the warfare continuing in Syria, but also for the American government.
Yeah, I'm not as certain as you are from what I read, and since I'm trying to keep an open mind about some of these things, about the OPCW whistleblowers and so forth. One of the two articles on Counterpunch have tried to counter that. One, of course, by Louis Project, and the other this morning by somebody else whose name I don't recall right now.
I haven't seen that.
Yeah, and it's a somewhat more understandable and judicious approach, saying that we don't really know, there really isn't evidence either way that it was a false flag or not a false flag. But I'm just it's one thing you can hear when you hear Theodore Postal being interviewed by the MIT scientist being interviewed by Aaron Mate. It's one thing to sort of want to trust his expert judgment on these things. And there's all this complications about an article he wrote that wasn't published, and so on and so forth. But ultimately these things tend to fall out. However people view this tends to fall out in terms of how they see Syria. And there's a group of people that will accuse anybody of who wants to support who opposes U.S. imperialism in Syria to be accused of being a sadist, the way Louis Project does,
right.
And that's kind of become a kind of a cult, and so you can't talk about these things, in a way that, in a kind of skeptical way that doesn't get you accused of being supporting this brutal dictator monster.
And he is, in fact, a brutal dictator monster who happens to be, on this point, the object of a hate campaign that supports the imperialist policies of the American government. Strange people notice this. Tucker Carlson, who is a leading voice on Fox News, says, and I'm quoting, "No one in Washington had seen the attack. No American had seen it. Nobody in Congress to tell you what proof existed that the attack had actually taken place or that Assad's government was behind it rather than some other faction, and there were many factions in the country's civil war. But it didn't matter that there was literally no evidence. Everybody in Washington began agitating for a regime change war immediately against Syria, immediately, especially on the left." Well, especially on the left, that's true. But the idea that it's Tucker Carlson, who is supposed to be on the right, who's saying this is scandalous. Jimmy Dore remarks, yes, and he's right, and that's sad. That's sad that when guys like Tucker Carlson and me are doing better journalism on the most important story right now, our next war, and he's getting it right. Well, I think Jimmy Dore is right in this case too.
Yeah, I just wish that the evidence that's presented would be less opaque to the general public in terms of what might have happened in Khan Sheikhoun or Duma or any of these places in which there's some doubt as to whether these attacks were a false flag. it isn't quite enough just to say that Assad had no reason to do that at that point in time, blah, blah, blah. You know, I don't know. It's just, you know,
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 49th week of 2019, a Fight Race Reductionism edition. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and occasionally some of his helpers.
He doesn't seem to have too many helpers lately.
No, he doesn't. See research notes for items we discussed tonight on the Facebook page for News from Neptune, prepared by J.B. Nicholson. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.